When we speak of Bharat Unleashed, when we constantly use the word Bharat these days as a fortunate substitute and synonym for India, and a better synonym in fact, and when we keep speaking of Amritkal as defining and animating the next quarter of a century, what does it exactly mean? It's perhaps easy to spend a few vague generalities which sound great, but what does it really translate to personally for each of us? As a practicing litigator, one of the first things that I'm expected to ask, and as a former engineer, is what is the physical significance of a mathematical equation? What does it translate to? So what is the significance of all these words that are being thrown around? And why is this relevant to an educational institution of all the places? So on the way, I was just thinking of what is it that I must present to this audience. I could either present my personal journey and hold myself up as a role model, which I don't wish to because I'm far from it. Or I could present a broader template for you to work towards, a larger vision, which I think is what drives people who've been invited to this conclave, to this conference. When you speak of Bharat Unleashed, in my small, limited head, I think of 3 C's. The first C being the master template or the background in which all of us trace our origins and identity, namely culture. The second C translates to consciousness, which has multiple ramifications. And the third C would be competence. So if I have to weave in each of these 3 C's for the purposes of a student, culturally inspired conscious competence is what I am looking at. Why is this crucial? When we speak of making the transition from India to Bharat, it is a transition from being a lookalike or a duplicate to something that is original. So this fundamental thrust of anybody who speaks of Bharat is originality in thought. That is my thrust as far as my interpretation of Bharat goes. Now there are 2 ways of interpreting original. One is to reject everything that's foreign, or the alternative being, first draw from native thought as much as possible. And where you think foreign thought has contributed better to a particular subject or a particular issue, certainly be inspired by it, but also have the cultural consciousness to Indianize it, to indigenize it, without mechanically and, let's say, slavishly importing any particular idea. The tragedy of the last 70 years of so-called independent Bharat's journey is not lack of talent, but lack of original thought, which is the fount of all confidence for any civilization, for any culture and any society. So it's impossible for an individual to think or assume that his individual confidence has got nothing to do with the confidence that the society enjoys and the very society that he comes from. You may be individually confident of your talent, so to speak, but when you represent a particular identity, especially a civilizational identity such as Bharatiya civilizational identity, you can't hope to have a certain identity or a certain confidence level which is completely independent of it, because the collective identity informs the individual identity and vice versa. Let's break this down for the engineering audience. What does this mean? If there is a certain problem which is commonly, which every civilization faces or which every society faces, what you bring to the table is not just your individual competence, but a certain pattern of thinking that is unique to the civilization that you come from. Which is one of the reasons I strongly believe that even individual competence is significantly inspired by the culture that you come from, which is why there's a Japanese way of thinking, there's a German way of thinking, there's a Swiss way of thinking, there's a Chinese way of thinking, there's an Israeli way of thinking. What is it that defines Bharatiya way of thinking is a question that we have not answered or even asked for the last 70 years. So if I have to look at the next 25 years, what is it that this journey must represent? What does it present to us as an opportunity in this historical time window? And because I'm in an educational institution, I have to make this statement. It is a re-education and a rediscovery and a reawakening of culture, consciousness and competence, all 3. The model of development that we currently subscribe to separates growth and sustainability, separates society and environment, which is one of the reasons that after having destroyed nature and civilization for at least 100 to 200 years, ever since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance and whatnot, suddenly the West has woken up to the concept of sustainable development, something that native indigenous cultures and Eastern cultures have always been familiar with. So today, a culture such as Bharat, whose faith system revolves around nature, chooses to treat sustainable development as a separate topic altogether without connecting it with the question of growth and development. It doesn't reflect originality. It reflects the same slavish mechanical aping and imitation of the West. I see from the questions that have been given to me, one of the questions is, how do we get rid of colonial influences? Let me answer that question as part of my opening dialogue here. I don't think any of us should be looking at freeing ourselves from colonial influences. That is a display of irrational xenophobia. And if anybody thinks that is what I stand for or my message translates to, they're reading it wrong. I'm saying before you respect the rest of the world for the contributions that they have made to the pool of human thought, have the civilizational confidence to respect your community, your society, and your culture first. That's where I come from. Respect for the rest of the world is not mutually exclusive to respect for the self. I don't see this as a zero-sum game where one excludes the other or where one has to survive at the expense of the other. The way of the future is going to be more interdependence and more collaboration, but without losing what is unique to you, without forgetting where you come from. This is especially true in the world of science, because there is a certain glamour that is associated with the technological advancement of the West, that it's easy for people who come from this part of the world to forget their roots or even look down upon their roots simply because the last 500 years or let's say 300 years of history has not been particularly kind to us. And therefore, I have only 3 or 4 suggestions to offer to the members of this audience in the hope that this would create a multiplier effect when they go out of this room. 1, your identity needs to strike a balance between who you are as an individual and the society that you come from. Both of them must inform your entire identity. Neither is complete in itself. At a time when you're being constantly told that individual identity and individualism is the pinnacle of human civilization, those societies who have been governed by this thought process, their terminal decline is happening right in front of your eyes, simply because they are not in a position to regain that sense of community, which is crucial simply because it is a reality, it is a civilizational, evolutionary reality that a person or a human being or a man or a woman is a social animal. That sense of identity is being lost. So when you think of Bharat Unleashed, when you think of employability, when you think of sustainability, when you think of growth, when you think of entrepreneurship, the mistake that you will make is to look at them in compartments. They are all connected. Surely this city must stand testimony to the reality of what happens when development and blind development outpaces cultural heritage and respect for nature. Surely this state must have that consciousness because this is perhaps the greenest possible state which has all the blessings of nature. And you can see the devastating transition that is happening right in front of your eyes when the same growth model of Bangalore is visiting other cities such as Mysore and second-tier cities of Karnataka. This is perhaps that time in history when we are poised to go ahead and higher, when we are equally being given an opportunity to hit reset on certain fundamental questions on how do we define growth, how do we define development. Can there be growth and development which is completely oblivious to its impact on nature and environment? I am not a Luddite, I am not anti-technology, I am an engineer myself, I practice in intellectual property, so this is as commercial an area of practice as it can get. And I say that, and I say this with a lot of responsibility. You might have the competence to create a fantastic drilling or boring machine that destroys mountains, but if you lack the consciousness and the civilizational, let's say, conscience to ask whether I should destroy nature in the first place, your competence will come back to kill everything else that you hold dear. So that is an example of a situation where myopic competence prevails over larger questions which affect everybody else. I'm certainly not in the realm of speculation or hypothesis when I say that issues such as climate change, water availability, and so on and so forth are going to animate the discussions for the next 25 to 30 years. That coincides with the 25 years you hope to be the period when Bharat rises again. So especially at a time when history is providing you with an opportunity to revive your roots and reclaim your lost glory, you're also going to be faced with those challenges which are crucial and which are existential. So you need to have answers to both. So my only suggestion is, it's easy to perhaps draw certain myopic, short-sighted lessons from YouTube reels and shorts which constantly float and create a personality cult around any individual. But no individual is bigger than the cause, and no individual is bigger than the society, no individual is bigger than the larger community. Competence can sometimes lead to a situation where your individual ego pushes you to the point of oblivion where you don't even know what is it that you're doing, where you're on such an ego high because you think you're so good at something that you don't realize the consequences of your actions on others. The story of development of the last 500 years is exactly that, where individual ego and human supremacism has come at the expense of environment. There is absolutely no respect for non-human beings in the current model of growth and development. I say this as a dog lover, as an animal lover. I say this as someone who equally believes that crackers must be burst on Diwali, but with responsibility. I am not anti-science. I am not anti-progress. I am not anti-development. But I think it's important to learn certain important lessons. And the best part of being a Bharatiya is that you don't need to learn these lessons from the West. Your culture, your civilization has always respected Prakriti, because there is no dharma without Prakriti. I have 4.5 minutes left. I'll just take some time to share an experience that I recently had. In August of this year, I had the good fortune of being in the Sannidhi of the Sringeri Acharyas. And there I also happened to visit the research center called the Advaita Research Center, ARC. I'm dropping names simply because you know that this is not some taxi driver story that a journalist created to push a political propaganda. These are real stories. So as part of my visit to that center, I came across a young scholar who basically hails from Andhra Pradesh, unfortunately divided Andhra Pradesh, who was sporting the shikha, the sacred tuft of hair, spoke perhaps in crisp English, was wearing the traditional attire, was a qualified or is a qualified aerospace engineer from the United States, who's grown up in the United States, has given up all of that to pursue Indic research in Sringeri. And his area of research happens to be principles of environmentalism that can be culled out from Arthashastra. His name, I think, is Lalitaditya. Fantastic name. Of the Karkota dynasty of Kashmir. That's where the name comes from. So this gentleman was looking at principles of environmentalism from Arthashastra, where Chanakya or Kautilya or Vishnugupta is specifying how do you use environment or a forest for military purposes, for espionage, for dharmic purposes, for environmental purposes, and for commercial purposes. One of the prescriptions, and perhaps an inbuilt prescription or a prohibition, is that you will not destroy an existing forest for commercial purposes. You must create a forest for it to be used for commercial purposes. So you must buy land, create a forest, so that you know what is the pain it takes to create a forest in the first place, the time that is consumed, before you fell a tree with quickening ease. That is the lesson that Chanakya teaches. There are enough and more principles to draw from. Why is it that it's important for you to know this about your culture? Because each time a so-called new idea presents itself, the person who receives that new idea is not only surprised or is not only expressing awe at that particular idea, he thinks, oh, the culture this idea has come from must be a superior culture to mine. That is the subconscious train of thought that goes on in people's heads. Fortunately or unfortunately so. So when people realize that this is the height of thought that this civilization has produced, is capable of producing, and the God's willing in plural will continue to be capable of producing, I think it does a lot to your confidence as an individual. So my request to you is, as much as you pursue your career as an engineer, I say this as an engineer who's transitioned to perhaps as humanitarian a subject as possible, which is law. Do not see engineering and humanities and the arts in silos. A lot of people who come from the science stream have a certain ego where they look down upon people who come from the liberal arts. Remember, you work, but policy will always be set by people who are from the humanities. So you will earn, but the person who decides how you shall spend and how much you shall spend will not be a person who's from your stream. So respect that area and find a way and my suggestion to this institution, which has done so much, is to find a way to destroy these walls which separate multiple areas as if they are meant to be learnt in compartments. Since we speak of Bharat Unleashed, the way of the future is to have people who are as competent when it comes to culture as they are in engineering, and who are equally qualified. So perhaps the way of the future is offering multiple majors in what seems like diametrically opposite areas of specialization. That is the only way you create a mind that has more humility, that understands it doesn't know everything, and is open to ideas from everybody else.